Hey guys, my name is Saheeb. Welcome to my channel, and today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. Greed, envy, and the desire to get wealth without much effort often push people to commit the most heinous and cynical crimes. Sometimes it is hard to imagine what cruelty a person is capable of for the sake of quick enrichment. For example, the murder of a close relative. The story of Elizabeth Vasquez is truly shocking and horrifying. This kind and hardworking woman all her life worked for the good of her family, striving to give her beloved daughter all the best, including a good education. But the greedy heiress, along with her boyfriend, did the unthinkable. This complex case for several years stirred the press and shocked the public with its inhumanity, showing how a young woman can easily decide to kill her own mother. Let's try to understand how, in a prosperous and well-to-do family, grew a real monster, devoid of any feelings of pity, remorse, or conscience. The large and happy Vasquez family in 1967, in the town of Cajamarca in northwestern Peru, a girl named Elizabeth, Lilian Vasquez Movilla, was born. She was the oldest of 6 children in the family of Ernesto Vasquez and Maria Movilla. Her parents were hardworking, simple people who worked hard to provide for their many offspring, give them an education and a chance at a better life. The Vasquez family was friendly and very happy, and from an early age, Elizabeth helped her mother take care of her younger siblings. She was an excellent student and graduated from school with honors, which allowed her to easily enter the prestigious university at the Faculty of Law and Economics. While at the university, she met a young man named Alejandro Mendez Espino, who was also studying law and was known as one of the top students in his class. A romantic relationship quickly developed between the two, which grew rapidly, and they were officially married in 1987, even before graduating from university. Elizabeth's parents approved of her choice from the very beginning and gladly accepted her son-in-law into the family. Alejandro was a serious, intelligent, ambitious, and very purposeful man who could take good care of their eldest daughter. At first, the newlyweds lived in the Vasquez family home, but after 6 months, when Elizabeth became pregnant, they decided to move into their separate home, only daughter, approximately a year after their marriage. In 1988, the couple welcomed their only joint heir, whom they named after the mother, Elizabeth Vasquez Espino, affectionately called Elita in the family. The girl became the center of attention for all her numerous relatives and the main joy of her parents. Several years after the birth of their daughter, the couple, whose careers were steadily ascending, decided to move to Peru's capital Lima by then. Alejandro was vying for a prosecutor position in an anti-corruption department, while Elizabeth had opened her own legal consulting firm. Both worked tirelessly for the benefit of their family, but unfortunately couldn't spend enough time with their young daughter. Confronted with an unsatisfactory experience hiring a nanny who didn't fulfill her duties conscientiously, the young mother decided to send her daughter to her parents in Cajamarca for them to take care of. The heiress Maria and Ernesto readily agreed, and were overjoyed to have their granddaughter live with them for a while. Notably, their youngest daughter, Giovanna, Alita's aunt, was only a couple of years older than Alita, so they immediately got along and interacted like real sisters. Due to their total commitment to work, the parents rarely saw their daughter and compensated by showering her with gifts during visits. Alita's stay at her grandparents' home stretched over several years, and when her parents decided to bring her back to their home in Lima, she had already started school. It's worth noting that the abrupt change in environment did not benefit the girl, and she took quite some time to adapt to life in the bustling, noisy capital after the quiet, almost provincial Cajamarca, the challenging parent-daughter relationship. As a child, Alita was a quiet and well-behaved kid. She strove to excel academically, engaging in music and foreign languages. She shared a warm and trusting relationship with her parents, who tried to compensate for the years of enforced separation. Elizabeth aimed to be not just a mother, but also Alita's best friend, someone she could share her deepest thoughts with. This remained true until Alita turned 15. During her teenage years, Alita's character deteriorated rapidly. She became rude through tantra, problems, and stopped listening to her parents. She abandoned her studies, got involved with bad company, and worst of all, began stealing money from her parents' wallets. Elizabeth tried various approaches to connect with her daughter, hoping it was just a phase that Alita would outgrow. However, the girl regularly instigated heated arguments with her mother, ending in hysterics and tears. During these moments, Alejandro typically remained neutral, but if Alita sought his intervention, he often took her side. Alida was deeply hurt and offended by being constantly compared to her smart, beautiful, successful, and hardworking mother next to Elizabeth. Alida indeed appeared as the ugly duckling, being the complete opposite of her mother in every aspect. She lacked striking looks, was overweight, lazy, and temperamental, often lied, and didn't shy away from theft. Alida harbored numerous complexes about her appearance when she expressed a desire for plastic surgery. Elizabeth, eager to please her daughter and mend their relationship, didn't dissuade her. Elizabeth financed an initial rhinoplasty for her daughter, and a few years later, several more surgeries in 2007 after 20 years of marriage. Alejandro and Elizabeth decided to separate. Their 18-year-old daughter reacted with a hysterical outburst, screaming, insulting, and blaming her mother for driving her father away. At the time, the family was in the United States, and the divorce posed some complications for citizens of another country. Nonetheless, they returned home as divorced individuals and began living separately by mutual agreement. The now adult but still dependent daughter stayed in her mother's house. They continued to have fierce arguments, and during such moments, Alida would call her father, crying and begging him to take her in. However, Alejandro, who had moved on with a new love, was not eager to do so. He always convinced Alida to reconcile with her mother and wait a bit longer until she finished university and started an independent life. Despite her plummeting academic performance, terrible character, and provocative behavior, Alida's parents ensured she enrolled in the law faculty of one of Peru's most prestigious universities. The education was costly, but her father and mother decided not to skimp on the education of their only child, Alida's unreliable boyfriend. Alida had her fair share of teenage romances, but at 19, she fell genuinely in love for the first time. It all started one Sunday morning at church, where she met a charming young man named Fernando Gonzalez. He couldn't take his eyes off her during the service, and afterward he approached her to introduce himself to Alida. Fernando seemed like a prince, handsome, attentive, with a pleasant voice. He invited her for coffee and a chat. As it turned out, he had a habit of scouting churches for young, well-dressed girls who arrived in luxury cars, then would strike up a conversation, charm them, and play on their sympathies. He'd spin tales about his difficult childhood in a large family abandoned by their father, how he was now supporting his mother, brothers, and sisters by working multiple jobs. Wealthy and naive girls would sympathize and give him money. Sometimes he managed to maintain a wealthy girlfriend for a few months, but typically they'd leave him once the truth was revealed. He was just an unemployed slacker who loved the high life. Alida fell easily into Fernando's trap due to her complexes, always considering herself unattractive. She couldn't believe such a handsome man noticed her and was ready to give him everything she had, or rather everything her mother had. She opened up to her mother about everything, leading to their first candid conversation in years. Elizabeth thought she had a chance to mend their relationship, especially since Alida had met the boy in church, which seemed promising, and assumed he must be a good person. Upon their first meeting, Fernando managed to make a positive impression on Elizabeth. He told her his dramatic life story, and she believed him. Deciding that such a good boy deserved help, she rented a cozy apartment for him near central Lima, agreeing to pay 70% of the monthly rent. She also paid for his business school tuition, promising him a job in her company. Later on, it seemed that Fernando gratefully accepted her generosity, ready to start studying. However, he had no interest in attending boring lectures or working. He just wanted to have fun and spend someone else's money. He gladly moved into the rented apartment, but never paid anything towards it, claiming to be broke and promising to pay back later. Soon it became clear that Fernando only attended a couple of business school classes before quitting. After a serious talk with Elizabeth, he seemed remorseful. She decided to give him a second chance, points, and employed him as a courier in her company. On his very first day, he not only failed to complete a simple task, but also betrayed other employees who had entrusted him with important documents. Elizabeth finally realized that this young man had charmed her daughter only to leech off her for his own needs. He had no intentions of studying or working. She then forbade Alida from seeing him, which provoked her daughter's anger and resentment. Alida screamed and cried, accusing her mother of trying to ruin her life and take away her happiness. She refused to listen to reason and insisted she would continue seeing Fernando. Failed attempt to separate the couple, Elizabeth decided to send her daughter to her parents' home for a while, naively believing that if Alida didn't see her boyfriend for a few months, her feelings would cool down, and Fernando would find another rich fool to exploit. But Elizabeth was greatly mistaken. Alida continued to communicate with her boyfriend through calls and social media, and her resentment towards her mother only grew. Fernando had to move out of the rental apartment after Elizabeth refused to pay for it. However, he found a smaller place rented for him by his young lover with her mother's money. Alida had some financial freedom being a spoiled child and could freely use some of her mother's accounts. When the summer break ended and university resumed, Alida immediately rushed to meet her boyfriend, who once again asked her for money. She withdrew a substantial amount from her mother's account and gave it to him, leading to a serious confrontation with her mother later that evening. Upon noticing the missing funds, Elizabeth then decided to block Alida's access to her accounts, giving her only a small weekly allowance for personal expenses. This decision further strained their already tense relationship. They barely spoke, mainly engaged in arguments, and Elizabeth's attempts to reach out to her daughter were unsuccessful. The monstrous plan during one of their romantic dates, when Alida couldn't bring Fernando the money he demanded, he became furiously angry. He cursed Elizabeth, screaming that she had plenty of money but wouldn't give any to her only daughter. Then added that if Elizabeth were gone adult, Alida would inherit all her wealth and they could live luxuriously. This terrible idea took root in Alida's mind, growing stronger each day. She constantly talked about how much she hated her mother, blamed her for all her misfortunes, and fantasized about how wonderful it would be if her mother disappeared. The young lovers began to devise a monstrous and cynical plan to eliminate Vasquez, also considering whom they could involve as accomplices. At that time, Elizabeth had nearly $3 million in her accounts, owned a successful business that could be sold, a large house in an elite area of the capital, several cars, and her life was insured for a significant amount in the event of her death. All of this would be inherited by her only child, Alida. Elizabeth seemed to sense danger. She realized she couldn't separate her daughter from the mercenary and deceitful young man who negatively influenced her. The situation was escalating and could resolve in the most unpredictable way. Being an experienced lawyer, Elizabeth drafted a will stating that in case of her sudden disappearance or untimely death, all money and property should go to Ernesto Vasquez, her father. She even managed to visit her parents and tell them about her decision. Meanwhile, Alida planned to stage the kidnapping and murder of her own mother by suspected criminals who would never be found. She and Fernando decided to involve a tough guy, Jorge Carnejo Ruiz, promising to pay him generously for his services. He accepted the offer without a second thought, a crime against his own mother. On January 24, 2010, 21-year-old Alida met with her 23-year-old boyfriend to finalize the plan for the crime that was to take place the next day. She was calm and collected, already envisioning how she would spend the millions she had inherited. The next morning, January 25th, citing ill health, Alida did not go to the university and stayed home when her mother left for work. Fernando and Jorge were already lurking outside the house, waiting for Alida to distract the guard and sneak them inside. Alida approached the guard on duty and asked him to buy painkillers from the nearest pharmacy, which was only a 5-minute walk away. This brief absence allowed the young men to sneak into the house and hide in the master bedroom. When Elizabeth returned, Alida loudly dropped a glass in the kitchen, signaling her attackers to gather. When Elizabeth entered her room, Fernando knocked her to the ground and began choking her with George holding her down. Miraculously, Elizabeth managed to break free and run out into the hallway, where her own daughter kicked her in the head while Elizabeth was uncommon. Conscious, they tied her up. However, their plans were disrupted by a young servant girl, Maria Celine, whom Alida tricked into another room and locked her in. When Elizabeth regained consciousness, her daughter, boyfriend, and their accomplice brutally tortured her, trying to find out the code to the safe and passwords to her bank accounts. Terrified, Elizabeth knew her daughter was in trouble, but had always blamed it on Gonzalez's bad influence. Now, however, she saw the monstrous nature of her only daughter. Elizabeth managed to loosen the restraints and fought back against her daughter, scratching and punching her until Fernando knocked her to the ground. And enraged, Alida kicked her mother and finally, in a fit of rage, grabbed a pillow and smothered her until she stopped showing signs of life. The trio then bound the lifeless body, duct-taped her mouth shut, and placed Elizabeth in the trunk of her own car, staging a kidnapping. Alida then sent another guard to get medication, allowing her accomplices to drive off the property. She later freed a terrified Maria, falsely claiming that she and her mother had quarreled but made up, and that her mother had gone to bed, a strange story of a kidnapping and the search for a missing woman. In the morning, the maid was preparing breakfast as usual, but Alida came to the kitchen and told her that her mother had gone to work early because of an important meeting. After that, Alida left the house to go to her mother's workplace. There, she walked into the office of Jessica Hippo, her mother's best friend and accountant, and tearfully reported that her mother was missing and that she was receiving strange, threatening, and ransom calls. The accountant immediately started blocking the accounts to prevent the intruders from accessing them, reported the incident to the police, and left the office for a while. When she returned, Alida was gone, and the office was in disarray, as if someone was looking for something. Later, it turned out that Elizabeth's will was missing, which Alida had learned about the day before by overhearing a telephone conversation using a key she had stolen from her mother. Alida had also taken a copy of the will and cash from the safe in her mother's study. Police arrived and inspected the house, interviewing the missing woman's daughter as well as the office staff, but gained no valuable information. All claimed that Vasquez had no enemies and no one had threatened her, so no one was initially listed as a suspect. The main theory was that it was a kidnapping for ransom. All that was left was to wait for a call from the criminals to receive further instructions and demands a terrifying discovery, and the first suspect. The day after Elizabeth's disappearance became known, it was reported that her car was found abandoned in a vacant lot outside of town. The interior was empty, but when law enforcement officers opened the trunk, they were shocked by what they found. Inside lay the lifeless body of a missing woman with signs of beatings. Forensic experts counted dozens of bruises, severe head trauma, and rope marks on the victim's body, indicating that the woman had been tied up and tried to free herself. It was also determined that Vasquez's death was caused by asphyxiation. Particles of blood and epithelium were found under her fingernails, indicating that she had resisted. It was now necessary to determine who the blood belonged to. At the lineup, Alida appeared as a grief-stricken daughter. She cried, wailed, and seemed almost unconscious. However, at the interrogation, she behaved quite differently. She was calm, even cold. Blooded, and the questions of the investigators, she was visibly annoyed. In addition, she constantly contradicted herself in her testimony when the police decided to check the information about the calls from the kidnappers and sent a request to the cell phone company. It turned out that Alida did not receive any calls. It also turned out that in the days before and after her mother's disappearance, Alida had been in frequent contact with one, Fernando Gonzalez, who they also decided to question. However, the young man either insisted on his innocence or remained silent. Irrefutable evidence and an arrest. Elizabeth's maternal grandparents were in charge of her funeral, while Elizabeth herself was indifferent, thinking only about how to get out of the situation, stay free, and save money. She called her father, who was already aware of what had happened and crying, told him of her innocence and asked for help. Her father advised her not to talk too much and promised to get her out of the situation, even though he knew perfectly well who had committed the crime. However, he did not want his daughter to go to prison because it would have cast a shadow of shame on Alejandro, who at the time held the high office of Justice of the Peace and President of the Supreme Court, and was a powerful and respected man. Meanwhile, forensic. Results showed that the blood and skin particles under the deceased's fingernails belonged to her daughter. Alida tried to claim that she had a serious quarrel with her mother and they briefly quarreled, but then made up. However, no one believed her anymore. Further inspection of Elizabeth's room with special equipment revealed numerous wiped traces of blood throughout the house, including in Alida's room, despite her attempts to wipe away the evidence. Alida's story that she had an argument with her mother in the evening, but then made up, and the claim that her mother left early for work the next morning and was never seen again quickly fell apart. She contradicted herself, first saying she had not gone into her mother's room and then remembering that she had the ransom calls were completely fabricated by her. The testimony of the maid, Maria Chalain, played a decisive role in the case. She told how on the night of the crime, Alida locked her in a room from where she heard Elizabeth's screams and sounds of struggle, but could not help after that night. She never saw her employer again, and Alida insisted that everything was fine with her mother, who had simply gone to work early. All of this led to the arrest of Alita and her boyfriend, the criminal trio, and the battle for the inheritance. Alita was arrested at her mother's house. Her boyfriend was detained a few hours later at an entertainment establishment, and the next morning, Jorge was arrested, betrayed by Fernando, who tried to blame the crime on him. It is noteworthy that it was Gonzalez who first began to testify, hoping that cooperation with the investigation will benefit him and help to mitigate the sentence. Meanwhile, Alejandro hired the best lawyers for his daughter, but realized that she will not be able to escape punishment. At the same time, he began to deal with Vasquez's inheritance, intending to take it for himself. Since the will had disappeared and the heiress was facing a long prison sentence, he claimed that he and Elizabeth had never divorced but simply lived apart, remaining legally married. Meanwhile, Ernesto Vasquez, Alita's grandfather, decided to visit his favorite granddaughter in prison to look her in the eye, as he could not believe that the girl he had known and raised since infancy could commit such a horrible act. However, Alita behaved arrogantly, shouted, insulted the older man, and stated that she did not wish to see him again. This encounter upset him greatly, leading to a heart attack, from which he was unable to recover and died 6 months later. The Vasquez family was unable to prove the existence of the will left in Ernesto's name, as the document disappeared from Elizabeth's office, and the notary's database seemingly taken care of by Alejandro. All documents and references to the couple's divorce also mysteriously disappeared, giving Alejandro the right to claim the deceased's inheritance, the trial, and the verdict. Despite attempts by Alita, Fernando, and Jorge to shift the blame onto each other, the investigation successfully reconstructed the events of that fateful evening and established the role of each participant in the crime. It was also proven that the trio acted in a deliberate conspiracy which greatly aggravated their guilt. A decisive role in the trial was played by the testimony of the maid Maria, who stated that Alejandro had threatened her, demanding that she give a different version of events, but she refused to comply. In May 2012, the court found all 3 defendants guilty. Initially, the prosecutor had requested that each participant in the murder be sentenced to 30 years imprisonment. While the men pleaded guilty, Alita continually played the victim. Fernando and Jorge were eventually sentenced to 28 years each, but Alita's trial was delayed. Alita claimed that the perpetrators were hired by relatives on her mother's side, who fabricated the inheritance story in order to take possession of Elizabeth's property and money. Her father held the same version of events. Attempts to declare Alita mentally ill and susceptible to manipulation by criminals also failed. This strategy proposed by Alejandro was to send her to a psychiatric hospital instead of prison, declaring her insane and incapable of fully and solely inheriting his wife's estate. Finally, in December 2012, the court delivered its final verdict, sentencing Alita to the maximum term of 30 years in prison. To this day, she and her accomplices are serving their sentences in prison. As for the disputed inheritance, its fate remains unresolved. In the spring of 2021, Alejandro died without becoming the only heir. The Vasquez family, through the court, seeks to exclude Alita from the list of claimants to Elizabeth's property, citing the fact that she is in prison for murder. Currently, the main claimant for the inheritance is Maria Movila, Elizabeth's mother. Thanks for watching, guys. Subscribe to the channel and also don't forget to click the bell. There are many shocking stories ahead.